President, I rise today to oppose this appalling piece of legislation, the Migration Amendment Protection and Other Measures Bill 2014. And I oppose it because it confirms what many other countries around the world are saying, and that is that Australia, as a state party in the United Nations, has gone rogue on human rights, gone rogue on international law, and gone rogue on torture. It is not something that the Australian community is proud of. It is not something that decent people around the world can understand. How is it that a country like Australia, a rich country, could imagine that it can behave so appallingly and absolutely thumb its nose at international law? And I don't know about other senators in this chamber, but I felt really ashamed and really horrified when the Special Rapporteur, Juan Mendez, and this is the Special Rapporteur to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, found that Australia's indefinite detention of asylum seekers on Manus Island, the harsh conditions, the failure to protect certain vulnerable individuals all amount to breaches of the Convention Against Torture. So our government is involved in torturing people. And that just turns up on the news in amongst everything else as if this is just normal behaviour in Australia. Torturing people. As a community, surely we do not support torture. As a community, surely we do support international law. And when Australia signs up to a convention on human rights, on refugees, on climate change, on biodiversity, whatever we sign up to in the international community, there are expectations that we will adhere to those rules. And yet under the Abbott government, and additionally under the former Rudd and Gillard governments, there has become this view of Australian exceptionalism, that for some reason all other countries in the United Nations have to adhere to environmental law or to international law, to refugee law, but Australia doesn't. Somehow our circumstances are so exceptional that everybody else should be held to the law except us, and we can do as we like. Well, we can't do as we like. We are shaming ourselves, we are demeaning Australia's reputation, and it is something the rest of the world will hold us to account for, not only now but into the future. We used to have a proud record, and now we have a record of shame. And I want to just go through some of the issues here. This bill carries with it the very likelihood that Australia will deport people back to danger, breaching our obligations under international law. It seriously compromises Australia's protection determination system. It erodes procedural safeguards and puts Australia at risk of breaching its non-refoulement obligations. You cannot send people back to a place where they are going to be tortured, raped, murdered, jailed and so on for the beliefs that they hold and the reasons that they are seeking asylum. It is not illegal to seek asylum. It is not. And yet day in, day out, we have Abbott government ministers talking about illegals, as if people are illegal when they are exercising their rights under international law. It is not illegal to seek asylum, and for the benefit of Senator McDonald and others, there is no queue. This idea that people seeking asylum are going outside some orderly queue is a complete and utter nonsense. There are people seeking asylum all over the world as a result of appalling changes of regime, as a result of wars, as a result of civil war. Look at the moment of what's happening in Syria, for example. Hundreds of thousands of refugees have poured across the border into Jordan and in other countries in the region. We are seeing massive trauma out of Afghanistan, out of Pakistan, Hazaras being tortured, out of Sri Lanka, people being tortured there under the Rajapaksa regime. There is no orderly queue. It is not illegal to seek asylum. That is what the government needs to understand and stop undermining international law. The idea that you would require someone to prove that they are more than 50% likely to be persecuted if they were returned is absolutely appalling and ridiculous. At the moment, people are not even being given an opportunity to explain their situation with this accelerated processing that has gone on under the former Labor government and now under this government, and brought to an absolute point with the Sri Lankan asylum seekers who were being interviewed at sea. And we know that just was a joke in the scheme of things in terms of any serious assessment of their claims for asylum. And I want to talk about Sri Lanka for a moment because it really highlights just how appalling this government is. The Rajapaksa regime, in my view, was the closest thing to a totalitarian dictatorship masquerading as a democracy that we had in this region. The Rajapaksa, Mahinda Rajapaksa and his brothers ran Sri Lanka as a police state. They got rid of the head of the judiciary. They disappeared anyone who stood up against the regime in white vans. The white van would pull up outside their place, the person would be dragged into the van, and then they would be tortured and disappear. And it wasn't just the Tamils. It was exactly as has happened in the past. They went after the intellectuals, they went after journalists, they went after anyone who was an opinion leader and disappeared them, tortured them, threatened them. And, of course, they went in a genocidal response to the Tamils, taking away their land, persecuting people, refusing to deal with the crimes that had occurred at the end of the Civil War. When the Rajapaksas sent the head of their admiralty who had been overseeing that shocking bombardment which killed hundreds and thousands of civilians at the end of the Civil War in the northeast, he was sent to Australia as Sri Lanka's High Commissioner. I wrote to Prime Minister Rudd at the time and said, do not accept his credentials. He is accused of international war crimes. He must not be accepted in Australia, and other countries had sent back the credentials and refused to recognise some of these criminals that were being sent out by the Rajapaksas. But no, the Labor government accepted his credentials, and I am very pleased to say that in the entire time he was here, I refused to meet with him, refused to go to any conferences, anything that he put on at the High Commission, and I am very pleased that the new Prime Minister in Sri Lanka has withdrawn and recalled all of these people, including 3 from the High Commission here in Canberra who've been accepted by Labor and Liberal governments as suitable people to represent the diplomatic corps. Well, at least the new government in Sri Lanka has recalled them, and they will suffer the consequences of the law in that country and go through the trials that will now occur about the war crimes that occurred at the end of the Civil War. But knowing full well what the Rajapaksas were doing, Australia has gone along with it, absolutely gone along with it, and sent Sri Lankan asylum seekers back to Sri Lanka, where we know people have been tortured and raped and jailed and worse since they have been returned. And yet you ask the Australian government through this whole time, what tracking did you do of the people you sent back? Oh, it's not our job to do that unless they come to the embassy and complain. It's not our job. We just send them back. And now we discover, as a result of the new Prime Minister who came out and said when human rights were being trampled and democracy was at bay, these countries were silent. This is an issue for Sri Lanka, and one of these countries was Australia. But worse than that, he came out, the new Prime Minister, Prime Minister Wickramasinghe, came out and said that Australia decided to pay the price of looking away at human rights abuses in Sri Lanka in order to get cooperation from the Rajapaksas on stopping asylum seeker boats. A deliberate strategy, an agreement between the former Australian government and this one to look away, but particularly the Abbott government did a deal with the Rajapaksas to look away on human rights in order to get cooperation to, quote, stop the boats. The domestic policy of stopping the boats, the popularity of the Abbott government was more important than what happened to those people, and more importantly as well to the fact that we as Australia decided proactively to ignore human rights in Sri Lanka and turn a blind eye. Well, of course, now, as inevitably occurs, a change in the regime has occurred, and we will see what actually is finally revealed. We won't get it out of here. It'll be refused under every FOI that anyone puts in, but we will get it from the Sri Lankan end of the extent to which former Minister Morrison and the Prime Minister Tony Abbott, how they secured this deal with the Rajapaksas to the point where Prime Minister Abbott said on the July 3rd, 2014, Sri Lanka is a society at peace, unquote. That is a cynical lie. It was known at the time to be untrue. It is not a country at peace. It was a country going after the Tamils, engaged in the most appalling behaviour, and here were we as a nation sending back people after screening them in the most superficial way and refouling them to Sri Lanka. This is an appalling indictment on our country. But I also go now to this notion of the 50%, but you have to prove you're 50% likely to be persecuted if you're returned. If you're only 49% likely to be tortured or raped, well, then you can be sent back to face that, but 51% likely you can stay. What a nonsense is that? Now, the High Court made a decision in interpretation of this back in 1989 with Justice Mason, when he said, look, this has to be interpreted as a substantial chance of suffering torture or jail or persecution if you're returned. A significant chance, a real chance. Not a remote chance, but a real chance. That is what you had to prove in order to be regarded as a refugee. It was not a choice of saying, well, you're more likely than not, which is how this government wants to change it. How can someone prove that they have a 50% or more or less chance of being persecuted? You either have a real chance of being persecuted or a remote chance. But 50%, it is going to be a totally subjective judgment, and it is yet another example of this government doing everything it can to send everybody back and say they were unable to prove to a satisfaction of a 50% test. So, you know, a 50% likelihood. Are you likely to be raped? 51% or 49%? Oh, well, let's make a decision on that, and off you go if you've got a 49% chance. That is appalling behaviour, contrary to the High Court ruling that was made in 1989 and has been actually upheld in the High Court ever since. But I also want to go just quickly to this issue of complementary protection. Now, this is for people who have been subjected to gross violations of their human rights, but for non-refugee convention reasons, because the Refugee Convention doesn't look particularly at issues of gender or sexuality. So people who face a real risk of torture upon returning to their country of origin, or women fleeing honour killings, genital mutilation, for example. Now, I find this extraordinary because Minister Bishop has made a very big issue of trying to crack down on female genital mutilation. She said, quite rightly, it's illegal in all states and territories. She has said it's vital that family members or friends who know about any such plans let authorities know. She was horrified at the prospect of fathers in families sending their daughters overseas where they're subjected to this practice. And we have the Minister who represents the Prime Minister on this, Senator Cash, coming out making great speeches and op-eds on her opposition to female genital mutilation, and yet we now have the very same government who is supposedly outraged by this practice now actually allowing people to be sent back to actually suffer this fate because you are abolishing complementary protection. That is appalling. That is absolutely appalling. We have got to the point where this legislation has been opposed by all the key stakeholders groups. You've got UNICEF, you've got the Law Council of Australia, the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law, Amnesty International, the ANU College of Law, the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, the Human Rights Law Centre, the UNHCR, all of them saying exactly what the Greens are saying here. This is contrary to international law, it's contrary to human rights, it's contrary to human decency, and it is making Australia's reputation globally go to a point where we are seen as a rogue nation. The UNHCR had this to say. The UNHCR's long-held view, supported widely by state practice, that it is incumbent upon the decision-maker to use the means at his or her disposal to produce the necessary evidence in relation to the application. This may not, however, always be successful, and there may also be elements that are not susceptible of proof. In such circumstances, if the applicant has made a genuine effort to substantiate his or her claim, all available evidence has been obtained and checked, and the examiner is satisfied as to the applicant's general credibility, the applicant should, unless there are good reasons to the contrary, be given the benefit of the doubt. Well, there is no benefit of the doubt here in this legislation. What this legislation does is remove the benefit of the doubt because the government wants to send people back, plain and simple. And you would think that Australia, in this exceptionalism that is talked about by the government, that we are somehow having this rash of refugees that doesn't occur in other countries. If you look at a country like Austria, for example, that has something like 70,000 a year, which dwarfs Australia, even if you look at 2013 as having 20,587, you've got 70,000 going into Austria. In Italy, in the first month of this year, they had 6,000 arrivals by boat, and yet they debate whether the lengths they go to rescue people are good enough and whether they need to do more. And what we've got is a situation where we pretend that countries like Jordan, suffering, as I said, hundreds of thousands of the pressure of refugees in that country, and yet they continue to offer refuge to people because they understand that these people are genuine. They are running away from conflict situations where their lives are at risk. Countries like Jordan deserve our support and assistance in doing what they can, but equally we have to do our bit doing what we can to uphold the law, uphold international law, recognise it is not illegal to seek asylum. That is the number one thing. Secondly, there is no queue. People leave for all kinds of reasons and regimes change. You cannot say today you have a 50% chance. You can't predict what is going to happen in the future, what the changes are going to be. You can take the evidence before you. And this government is determined to do everything it can to actually load the whole system against the poorest, most vulnerable people that you could find, and that's people who've been forced to leave their country because of fear of their life, because of fear for their families and for their future. This really is a disgraceful piece of legislation and should be opposed on the basis that it is against humanity, against international law and against common decency. And as Australians representing our community in this parliament, we should vote it down.